Llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Macané. Llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cedro voy para Macané. Llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. Que te tengo, no te lo puedo negar. Se me sale la babita, yo no lo puedo evitar. Cuando Juanita y Chan Chan en el mar servían arena como sal.
There were 4 distinct waves of Cuban immigration to the U.S.
While there was a slow trickle of Cuban immigration to America prior to 1959, the first significant wave of immigrants came to the U.S. in 1959 when Fidel Castro came to power. Many upper-class, educated Cuban citizens looked to America as a place of refuge from Castro's communist regime.
My parents kept thinking that it was going to be temporary, that Castro was not going to last, and that we wouldn't have to leave our homeland.
My parents belonged to a yacht club called Havana Yacht Club. We had several drivers, we had servants, maids, so it was a really good life that was taken away from us when we had to migrate.
One day somebody told my dad that he wanted that we 3 girls, that we are 3 daughters, had to go to the countryside to cut sugarcane. And that's when he realized that he could not raise his daughters anymore in this regime. And he did not want us to go to forced labor.
In 1960, Operation Pedro Pan began, where over the course of 2 years, 14,048 unaccompanied Cuban children arrived in the U.S.
The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 drove more refugees from Cuba. The group of immigrants were a more diversified group than before, which consisted of middle-class and urban working class. By the end of 1962, official figures reported 215,323 Cuban émigrés in the U.S.
The sharply increasing number of Cuban exiles rushing into downtown Miami created a neighborhood named Little Havana.
They transformed the culture of the area. For the years to follow, Cubans continued to settle in this 4-square-mile area in Miami's southwest section, maintaining their Cuban heritage.
During this time, the American government was more concerned with the political benefits of embarrassing Castro than anything else, so Cuban émigrés got special treatment that no other immigrant group received, affecting their assimilation process.
In 1961, the Kennedy administration implemented the Cuban Refugee Program. Based in Miami, it worked to relocate Cuban immigrants to various cities throughout the U.S.
In 1962, the Migration and Refugee Assistance Act was passed under the Kennedy administration, allowing for federal assistance for Cuban refugees.
In Miami, I remember we went to a place called the Freedom Tower, which is still there today, and we were given like a care package, I guess, clothing, because we left with the clothes on our back. The Cuban government did not allow you to take anything, not your jewelry, not your mementos, your family heirlooms, your family photographs, nothing. We had to arrive with nothing, so the federal government did give out like coats and clothing, and we felt very welcome, and it was a very generous welcome when we arrived here, so we were very grateful.
In 1966, the Cuban Adjustment Act allowed Cubans to become citizens after 2 years in the United States. They were given the ability to quickly revalidate their professional degrees that they had gotten in Cuba, allowing them to readily move upwards in society. With this advantage, they were fast-tracked on the road to citizenship and could access benefits of Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment compensation, and other federal aid.
All of this government assistance mobilized a thriving Cuban America enclave to develop in Miami.
The second wave of immigration is marked with the year 1965. It emerged with the Freedom Flights, which established an air bridge between Veradero and Miami.
There were basically two flights a day that brought Cubans from the island to Miami 5 times a week. And we were only allowed to bring basically the clothes on our back and one suitcase.
In 1 month, 2,979 Cubans make it to the U.S., many of whom had relatives already living in Miami. In September, Castro declares that Cubans with relatives living in the United States are allowed to leave through the port of Camarioca. By this time, more than 25% of Cubans that were relocated by the Cuban Refugee Program returned to Miami from other locations.
While in the north, they had worked to build capital in high-wage industrial regions. When these immigrants migrated back to Miami with investments made from the north, an economic enclave was created. From 1967 to 1976, Cuban-owned enterprises increased from 919 to around 8,000. Most were small, yet heavily employed firms, usually concentrated on textiles, leather, furniture, cigar making, construction, and finance. 40% of construction companies were Cuban-owned, and 20% of the local commercial banks were controlled by Cuban emigres. Throughout almost a decade, thousands of immigrants fled, taking advantage of the newly instilled immigration programs. The end of this stage was marked with the end of the Freedom Flights. By 1973, 260,561 Cubans were brought to the U.S. Most of these immigrants were middle-class Cubans escaping the political climate.
The third wave of immigrants is characterized by the 1980 Cuban exodus, in which Castro loosened immigration restrictions by letting people leave Cuba without a permit. The chaotic exodus, beginning with the Mariel boat lift, was very distinct from previous migrations. The majority of the 125,000 Cubans who immigrated during the Mariel boat lift, known as the Marielitos, were of working-class background and had less than a high school education.
They are called Marielitos. As they left Cuba, Castro called them escoria, which means scum.
Fidel Castro himself publicly stated, "I have flushed the toilets of Cuba and the United States."
It is true that Castro played a trick on President Carter and did open up the jails and did open up the insane asylums. That is the truth.
This was the first time that Cuban Americans were not well received by the American public and faced hostility. Negative stereotypes that all of these new Cuban immigrants were criminals, prisoners, and mentally ill made it difficult for them to assimilate.
However, these stereotypes were exaggerated. Only about 3% or less of Marielitos were hardened criminals. While many prisoners were released, most were imprisoned on Castro's sweeping judgments, such as being homosexual in public.
There was a sector that had been in Cuban prisons. It was all over the news, but a lot of these people were in prison, because they were political prisoners, protesting, speaking out against the country. I mean, you don't know if they stole some food because their family was hungry, or they were really hardened criminals that, they really needed to be jailed, that were a danger to society. For the most part, I remember, families reuniting with their loved ones. It was very emotional.
Marielitos transformed Miami's Cuban community significantly.
There was a huge influx of new students, and none of them spoke any English. The school was absolutely overwhelmed. They didn't have room for them. They were adding extra classes, sticking them in the basement.
The sharp increase of 85,000 immigrants into Miami in 1 year also created housing problems, unemployment, and crime.
Mariel refugees experienced long periods of unemployment, low-paid work, and welfare dependence that the older immigrants did not face.
The problems that resulted from the Marielitos' arrival were associated with the old immigrants as well, deepening the divide and increasing tensions between the old and the new.
It's important to understand that the root of the change between immigrant groups was Castro's regime in Cuba. Cubans from later generations no longer had the ability to get a higher education and did not know of a better life before Castro. They were now searching for economic relief, not political refuge.
Immigration before the Mariel, which is in the early 60s, of my parents and me when I was a very young child, that was a different immigration than the one today. Then you had the educated Cubans, the lawyers, the engineers, the doctors leaving. My family is all lawyers. My grandfather owned a sugar mill. All of that was appropriated by the government. So that exodus was of professionals of the upper crust of Cuban society. And they came here looking for freedom, not looking for a better life, because prior to Castro, they had a wonderful life.
Right.
As the years progressed and Castro's regime takes hold, then it starts changing, because everybody now is hungry. There is no better life now because there's no food, there's no medicine.
The fourth wave of immigration began in 1982 when the Cuban government allowed its citizens to seek refuge in America through raft or sea vessel. This wave allowed 40,000 balseros to embark on the 90-mile journey to U.S. freedom.
In 1984, the Cuban government agreed to accept the return of 2,746 Mariel immigrants with criminal records deemed excludable aliens by the U.S.
After 1994, the U.S. implemented a lottery visa allowing 20,000 Cubans to immigrate to the country annually. The Clinton administration enacted the wet foot, dry foot policy, stating that those who are caught at sea must be sent back to Cuba, while refugees that reach America's shores are able to stay.
They were leaving dangerously on boats made out of nothing. If they were happy, you wouldn't see people brazing the open ocean in the heat and shark-infested ocean. So, I mean, the fact that people are leaving their homeland means something. Nobody leaves your homeland if you don't have to. Nobody wants to.
This policy was then challenged in 1999 when Elian Gonzalez was caught in between an international custody battle involving both his parents, the Cuban government, and the U.S. government. Elian and his mother escaped Castro's regime by traveling to America on a raft, but she passed away during the journey.
His father, who had divorced his mother in 1993, argued the boy must be returned to him in Cuba. Elian's U.S. relatives fought to gain custody of the boy. According to the wet foot, dry foot policy, Elian should have been able to stay in the U.S., which is why this caused such a controversy. In the end, the Clinton administration removed Elian from his relatives with military force to return to his father in Cuba, easing tensions between the two countries.
The wet foot, dry foot policy was revoked in 2017 under the Obama administration.
This gained much support from those who believed Cuban immigrants should no longer receive unfair special treatment, but evoked heartbreak from those who traveled the dangerous 90 miles and made it to land only to be turned around. It also faced criticism from some Cuban Americans.
Think about a group of people that are traveling 90 miles in very dangerous waters to get here for freedom. I mean, think about that. That's how badly they wanted freedom, you know.
Today, the majority of Cuban immigrants have settled in Miami, especially concentrated in Little Havana. 23% of Cuban immigrants were employed in sales or office jobs, and 18% were employed in jobs relating to production and transportation, which is more than the foreign-born population. However, they received a median income of $35,400, which is much less than any other immigrant household or native-born citizen, but more than other Hispanic immigrant groups.
20% of Cubans today live in poverty. This is 4% higher than the U.S. population living in poverty, but still 6% lower than the total number of Hispanics living in poverty.
21% of Cuban immigrants had a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 28% of other immigrants and 30% of native-born people. The successive lower status of Cuban immigrant waves made it harder for them to integrate both economically and socially.
Cubans are seen as a prosperous immigrant group, especially compared to that of other Hispanic immigrant groups, like Mexicans. However, things aren't looking positive for Cuban immigration in years to come.
Although Cuban immigrants were once pawns in the Cold War for the U.S. government, they slowly began to lose their special treatment and are now treated more like other Hispanic immigrant groups.
President Trump recently made an announcement in Little Havana on June 16th regarding Cuban travel and trade restrictions. Trump plans to tighten travel restrictions which were loosened under the Obama administration. U.S. citizens will no longer be able to travel to Cuba for vacations, and U.S. companies are prohibited from doing business with any trade run by the Cuban military. President Trump does plan, however, to keep the embassies in Washington and Havana open, and this policy in no way affects Cuban Americans from seeing their relatives on the island.
Okay, Trump's new policy on I think where he's heading for it is in a good place, meaning that you should demand something for all the what we gave. I do understand that the embargo hasn't seemed to work for the 50 years that the Castros are in power, and that opening up conversation is good.
Cuban immigration is very unique. The problems and hardships that they have faced have not been from discrimination or government neglect. Almost all of the hardships Cuban Americans have faced, as well as the help they have received, have been rooted in the Castro regime corrupted their homeland. Castro assuming power was the reason the initial exodus took place. The fact that the communist regime was unfriendly towards the United States was the reason the American government had such a heavy hand in supporting Cuban Americans. The successively less educated waves of Cuban Americans was because they were unable to become educated in Cuba. The negative association tied to Cuban Americans after the Mariel boat lift was because Castro opened the Cuban prisons. The wet foot, dry foot policy was enacted because Cuban Americans were risking their lives to escape the oppressive government. The reason that each wave of Cuban immigrants is so distinct is because as the Castro regime continued, the lives and minds of the Cubans living under it changed dramatically.
Cristina Garcia's Dreaming in Cuban speaks to the generation gap that is especially present in Cuban immigrants. The grandmother clung to her past in Cuba and therefore was unwilling to leave Cuba. That's it. My mind's made up. I'm going back to Cuba. I'm fed up with everything around here. Her daughter, Lloyd, grew up with the oppressive communist regime and therefore fully embraced her newfound American identity and fully rejected her Cuban heritage. Mom says communist the way some people say cancer, low and fierce. She reads the newspapers page by page for leftist conspiracies, jams her finger against imagined evidence, and says, "See, what did I tell you?" She considers herself lucky. Immigration has redefined her, and she is grateful. Unlike her husband, she welcomes her adopted language, its possibilities for reinvention. However, her daughter Pilar was caught between the two worlds. She blamed America for all her personal hardships and looked toward Cuba as the solution to all her problems. Even though I've been living in Brooklyn all my life, it doesn't feel like home to me. I'm not sure Cuba is, but I want to find out. Just as portrayed in Dreaming in Cuban, each wave of immigrants embraced their new American identity differently. The differences in ideologies came as each opinion was a reflection of the political landscape in Cuba. For the first wave of immigrants, they viewed their life in Cuba as a great place, and America was just a temporary solution until they could return home. For the waves to follow, they began to leave out of necessity. With that, these new immigrants had no memories left of life in Cuba before Castro. Alongside, as Cuban immigrants continued to come, and those arriving were of less social status, these immigrants became less received and supported by the U.S. government and people.
Llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cero voy para Marcané. Llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí.